Hey makers, it's Jen with Minerva. Today I want to talk about pattern hacking. What is pattern hacking? Well, it's essentially taking an existing pattern and recreating it with new pattern pieces to make an entirely new different style. If you love something that fits really great that you've made before, it's a great idea to use it to hack it and make a different pattern from it. Today, I'm going to be working with the Simplicity 8657 pattern hacking pattern. I'm really excited to be working with this. This is just a really great base pattern that we can kind of really do whatever we want with. And it is sized extra small through 2XL. And the chest goes up to 48 inches and the hip says it goes up to 50. But when I measured the pattern, the finished hip is actually 62 inches and the bust is 61. So there's definitely quite a bit of ease built into this pattern. So I think it opens up the sizing quite a bit. I'm going to be using this really fun, colorful Lady McElroy Marley cotton lawn print. It's really super cool. It's so bright, so colorful. It has a really soft hand. It does have a little bit of stiffness, just like any lawn, but it's super soft. To get started, I need to pull out my front and back pattern pieces so that I can trace off the pattern to make the subtle pattern adjustments. So I have my front piece here, and it's actually the front and the sleeve. It's all in one piece. And I am going to get some paper and use my tracing wheel, and I'm going to just be marking which pattern I need and marking it along my paper. I went ahead and marked off the front of the pattern that I needed on some brown paper. So all I did was place my tissue paper on top of some brown paper and I traced around. And then I came back in and used a ruler and pencil to true up my lines and make sure that they were nice and straight. So because most of these patterns come with existing seam allowance, this one was marked at 5/8 of a seam allowance. I went ahead and marked my seam allowance here and all over the pattern. So I didn't do anything too crazy with the front. It is almost identical to what the pattern is. And I used the longer line on the pattern front for my shirt. And then I made sure that I had seam allowance at the center front because I'm going to have that center front seam that has the ruched channeling in there. The back piece also has a long kind of deep V neckline. I didn't want that for this top. I wanted it to be able to kind of stay up on my shoulders a little bit better. So I decided to raise the neckline. A good rule of thumb for a back neckline is typically somewhere between 3/4 of an inch to 2 inches for kind of a neckline depth. So I took a straight line out and I measured down 2 inches and then I created a curved line and I added 3/8 of a seam allowance here so that I can have some kind of seam finishing here. It's going to be time to start cutting out our fabric. This Lady McElroy print is directional, so we want to make sure that we are placing our pattern pieces with the top facing up so that none of our faces are upside down. So the side front piece, I do have a center front seam, so I do not need to place this on the fold. My center back piece, I don't want a center seam, so I am going to be placing this along the fold line. Some additional pieces that I didn't actually make pattern pieces for because they're very simple are going to be the ruched strings that I need. So I'm going to be cutting 2 per each center front and 2 per shoulder seam. So I'm going to be needing 6 total, and I'm going to cut those at 2 inches by 24 inches. And that was just kind of something I figured out how long I needed it to be. Roughly, I'm going to be taking this about 8 inches up and ruching down, and that kind of gave me some extra space for being able to tie my ties. It may be slightly too long once I get this finished. We can always adjust it afterwards, but that was what the math I did in my head. So I'm going to be laying these out and cutting out my fabric and cutting out my ruched band ties. I also am going to be I need to do some kind of neckline finishing. I'm going to be just doing a very simple 3/4 inch binding along the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut a long strip using the extra space I have along the edge of the fabric. And I'm going to be cutting a 3/4 inch wide strip as well. Before I get started with sewing, I am going to be preparing these strips. So they are a cut width of 2 inches, which means I can turn these back a 1/2 inch on both sides. And then I'm going to give these a press. And then I'm going to fold it once again towards itself and enclose those seam allowances and press again. And then this will be ready for us to kind of stitch down and be ready to insert into our top. I am going to want to add some seam finishing to my center front and my shoulder seams. Mainly because these are going to be opened seams on the interior. So, and because this is just a woven fabric, it may fray just slightly. So adding some serging or a simple zigzag stitch or using some pinking shears along the edge to kind of help finish this edge off will be ideal. So we want to do that along the center front, the shoulder seams of the front, and then the shoulder seams of the back. I've prepared both of my fronts with some serging along the center front and the shoulder seam, as well as the back along the shoulder seam as well. So the way we're going to put this together, it might seem a little funky, and that is because we want our edges to be finished before we sew our channeling for our ruching strips. That way they continue to have a hole that they can fit through. So to start out, we're actually going to be sewing our side seams first, and then adding whatever seam allowance or seam finishing that you want. So either serging, pinking shears, or a zigzag stitch. And because this has kind of a grown on sleeve, I really prefer to keep my seam allowance closed versus open. We'll be having open seam allowance over here, and that's why we serged these or finished these individually. But over here, so that we can kind of push the entire seam to the back so that it takes this curve a little bit better, we can create our seam finishing together so that it's a closed seam. So I am going to place my front and back together along the side seams. And I am going to be stitching each side seam. Now that we have our side seam stitched up, I went ahead and added my seam finish, and I did this as a closed seam again so that we could just turn everything and press it towards the back. It just kind of helps with, to avoid having to clip into this seam for this grown on sleeve. So in another twist, we are going to be working on our hem finishes next. So we can work with our bottom hem as well as our sleeve hems are going to need to be done as well. So all we're going to be doing for that is just a simple double turned hem. You could choose any kind of hem finish that you wanted, but I'm just going to be doing a simple double turn hem. I left about a 1/2 inch for my seam allowance or my hem finish. So I'm going to be working within that. So you could have added more or less if you wanted, depending on your style. I have added my hems to both the bottom of my shirt as well as my sleeve. And this was just a double turn hem that I used. I turned it 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch for a total of a 1/2 inch. So now it is time to sew up our shoulder seams. We're not going to do the center front seam yet. We're just going to do the shoulder seams and then press the seams open. While I'm there, I'm going to go ahead and get my ties for my ruching. And I already pre-pressed these a few steps back. And I'm just going to be running a top stitch along the edge to close up the seam. And then along the bottom, I am going to be double turning this and folding it to stitch it down. I'm doing this because I am not sure if these are going to be a little too long. I was a little generous with these just to make sure. And so I just want an easier way to finish them off if I need to cut them after I have finished the garment because they're too long. But if you want, you could easily open this up and fold it back and finish stitch across here. And then you could have a nice, then turn it out and then you could have a nice clean finish. It's really up to you. But because I might have to trim these down, I am going to just do a quick double turn so that there is a little bit of a seam here. You could also tie these if you wanted to just tie the ends. Up to you. These are a little thick for me to want to tie them, but I'm going to just do the double turn. As you can see, we stitched up our shoulder seams and then pressed the seam open. This is so we'll make our channeling for our ruching strips in a little bit. And this is also why we finished our hems first before we stitched up our shoulder seam. So when we have this line of stitching here, our strips can still be pulled through and everything is nice and clean and finished. So we did not stitch up the center front seam, and that's because there's kind of a deep V neckline here, and that just gets tricky when we're utilizing kind of a binding around that V. So I always like to use the seam as kind of a way to finish off the binding. So I created a 3/4 inch binding strip. This particular one is not cut on the bias. So you could cut it on the bias. I tend to not. I find them extra finicky and you don't necessarily need the give that bias will lend. So I kind of randomly cut a strip along with my 24-inch strips for my ruching pieces. And so I created 2 strips that are 24 inches as well. I wanted to put the seam at the center back. So I'm going to go here towards my center back. I kind of have it marked already. And I'm going to be placing that back binding seam along there. And then I'm just going to kind of hand measure all the way over and start my binding piece along the front edge. I want to follow the kind of slanted line of the neckline and not necessarily this folded back piece. So I'm going to be going to my machine and I'm going to be stitching at 1/4 of an inch all the way around the neckline. Once I do that, I'm going to flip this up and I'm going to be understitching, which means understitching means we're going to be flipping the seam allowance under the binding and we're going to be stitching at about 1/8 of an inch along this edge of this binding piece all the way around the neckline. Okay, as you can see, I stitched on this binding and then I understitched along the edge of the binding itself while turning the seam allowance towards the binding itself. So now we're going to do the second steps to these. So that means we're going to be folding this again. If you want to press this step, you can. You can hop on over to the iron and fold and press this down. I tend to do it all in one step. I just fold this and then flip it again towards the wrong side of the fabric. And then I stitch down along the other edge of the binding. And then when you're finished, you'll have this nice clean edge along your neckline. Check out this neckline. I really love using just a simple binding for necklines just because they're just less cumbersome than having a facing or something like that, and just creates a nice clean look. And you can see that even though I didn't cut these on the bias, the curve of this neckline isn't super severe. So this still laid flat and I didn't have to fight with turning a bias cut binding. Sometimes they can be quite ornery and finicky. So we are going to finally stitch up this center front seam. So turning everything right side out, it is going to be best to match at your top so that your top seams match. And we're going to be stitching at 5/8 of an inch all the way down. And we want to make sure our bottom seams match as well. Very important. I went ahead and stitched up my center front seam and then I went ahead and slipped my shirt on. I did this because I really wanted to know how far up I wanted the ruching to go. When I tried it on, I kind of determined that I wanted this to be about 6.5 inches below the neckline. So I put a pin here and then I stitched down each side, attaching the seam allowance to the front. And this is just going to create my channeling that my strings are going into. And then I went ahead and did the same thing for the shoulder. And I did this about 3 inches away from the neckline. And now I'm going to grab my strings and I'm going to be using a turning tool that is used for like creating spaghetti straps. You could also use a safety pin, attaching the safety pin to the top and then pulling it through. This one, with using this, it'll just be a little bit faster. So I'm going to come over here and find where it's opened and I'm going to push this all the way through. It comes out the other end and then I can attach the end that I did not sew and I can just kind of poke it through and then pulling it all the way through. So I want to pull this just slightly above where my stitching is and I'm going to place a pin there to keep it in place while I do the other ones. Time to do the rest of them. Okay, now that I have both of these in place, I am going to go ahead and just top stitch and kind of close this box up while I'm catching my strips so that they don't pull out. And then I'm going to repeat that same process for both sleeves. Here we have it. We put in our straps so that we can make this a ruched top. So I'm just going to pull these a little bit and spread them out. And tie it in a bow. And repeat for the other sides. Check it out, makers! This top is so colorful and so much fun. I hope I got your sojo moving today because pattern hacking can be really simple, and using this simplicity pattern is a great place to start.